Hi, my name is Philip Dustan. I'm a professor at the College of Charleston. I teach ecology and I study reefs. And I would like to share some of my observations on the coral reefs of Raja Ampat that I've made in the last 2 years, especially this December, most recently, 2018. But before I do that, I would like to explain a little bit about my perspective of coral reefs and what we know about reefs on a global basis. They are in over 100 countries around the world, centered in the tropics. They have been valued at providing over 375 billion US dollars per year in ecological goods and services. And these services include a tourist economy, the biodiversity that holds potential pharmaceuticals and other amazing compounds that we might be able to use. They protect the shoreline of these countries from large waves. They provide habitat for fisheries. They're a major source of protein for over 1 billion people on Earth. And they provide environmental security for those people that live on islands and in countries that have coral reefs. The loss of coral reefs has been very fast and is occurring globally around the world. The stressors are nested. They're global, regional, and local. When we see or think of coral reefs in their intact condition, we think of places like Carey's Fort Reef in the Florida Keys in 1975, where I began some of my research. And by 1985, the reef had changed and it was beginning to degrade. 10 years later, 1995, that degradation continued. 2004, most of the structure of the coral reef system was gone. And by 2014, there was little left except the skeletons of corals that are now bioeroding and turning into sediment. This was the richest, best example of a coral reef in the Florida Keys, and now it's gone. Dancing Lady Reef in Discovery Bay, Jamaica. It's one of the best known reefs to science. In 1972, the Four Reef Terrace at 10 meters had these beautiful fields of Acropora silvicornis, punctuated with large colonies of Orbicella. In 2013, that reef in the same place looked like this. It's hard to imagine that this kind of change could occur in such a short time. Symphony Reef on Magellan Island, a reef that we discovered and named Symphony because it was so beautiful. It was just playing a beautiful biological symphony to us whenever we dove on it. It's one of the most beautiful reefs I've ever seen in my life. By 2017, that reef had collapsed. And it had collapsed from anchor scars, storm damage, and a global heat wave that swept across parts of Indonesia and the Pacific Islands and globally and caused a serious amount of coral bleaching and subsequent death. It sort of makes you feel like you're walking into a war zone when you see these reefs. The entire civilization of the reef has collapsed, much like in a war zone in Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan, where what we've seen is the destruction of the infrastructure. Another example is a clear-cut forest, where the trees that provide habitat for birds and other animals, much the way corals provide habitat for fish, are gone. So the question is, can we imagine a world without coral reefs? The interesting thing about reefs, and we used to call it the coral reef paradox in the realm of reef science, is that they exhibit very high productivity and very rich biomass in nutrient-poor tropical seas. So the question has always been, where do all the nutrients and environmental conditions come that support this luxuriant coral reef growth? And it turns out that it's an evolutionary adaptation that reefs and reef organisms have that allow them to exist in these climates. And their very adaptations, as you'll see, make them vulnerable to human activities. So reefs require high sunlight, low nutrients, and very low amounts of sediments. There's very intense herbivory, the eating of plants, and very high filtration rate. The reefs have been thought of as a wall of mouths, and they live in the very predictable climatology of the tropics. And what we have seen is the evolution of many symbiotic relationships between animals and plants and between different animals. So when we see a reef, it's much like seeing a fantastic city with all these different animals and plants interacting with one another, overgrowing, bustling, and each individual colony or each individual species or individual fish is just acting according to the laws of natural selection. And when it's successful, it becomes more abundant. And when it's less successful, it's less abundant. And you can imagine that every single organism on the reef has a role, or we might think of it as a job, just the way people in cities have different roles, different jobs, and different positions within the economic and social structure of that city. Corals provide the reef framework. They're the structural elements of coral reefs. And in this cross-section through the Key Largo limestone in Florida, you can see a cross-section of a coral skeleton growing out of the water, much like a giant candelabra. Now, this reef was formed about 100,000 years ago when sea level was higher. The coral itself is about 800 years old. And what we see is the coral providing the framework, and the sediments, the carbonate sediments that are generated on the reef, get packed in and around that skeleton and become lithified or turned to carbonate rock. So the process of reef building needs a framework, which is provided by corals, and then the infilling sediments, which are the result of calcium carbonate deposition by many organisms, including animals that make shells, other corals, animals that make spicules, etc., etc., etc. Corals themselves are voracious carnivores. They expand their polyps to feed, and every single polyp has a mouth at its center surrounded by rings of tentacles equipped with stinging cells or nematocysts to capture prey. So the surface of a coral has actually been described as the greatest amount of predatory surface area that of any organism that's alive today. They are essentially the wall of mouths that we talk about. When the sun is out in the daytime, corals contract, and the polyp's tentacles are contracted within the polyp, and we can see this yellow-brown color that's there, and that's the symbiotic algae that live inside the animal tissue. So the coral is both an animal at night when it's a predator and a plant in the daytime when it's carrying out photosynthesis. And this symbiotic relationship is the key to coral reef health and success. And all of that occurs on the surface of the coral skeleton. So corals have what we call an exoskeleton. They deposit their skeleton below their tissue and they slowly get larger. The corals and the algae and the whole coral relationship is yet just but 3 cell layers thick. It's thinner than a credit card. It's about the thickness of a plastic bag. So when a coral gets injured on its surface, it has to grow from the sides to recover. It's not like you or I, when we get cut or we get scraped, our body will heal from inside out. Corals don't have an inside to heal from. All they have is this external layer of thin tissue that sits over their exoskeleton. Inside the coral tissue is where the algae live. And the zooxanthellae, that's what the algae are called, carry out photosynthesis. They use the waste products of animal metabolism to generate various kinds of food for the coral animal. They leak various kinds of nutritious food for the animal, and their photosynthesis increases the deposition rate of calcium carbonate. They exhibit light-enhanced calcification. So the zooxanthellae help the animal grow, help its skeleton grow, and recycle nutrients within the animal. It's very similar to what we think of as forest nutrient recycling, where the vegetation, when it dies, falls on the ground and is turned back into some sort of nutrients that are then reabsorbed by the trees. Most of the nutrients in a forest are actually held within the trees in their biomass, their living biomass. Just like on the reef, most of the nutrients are held within the living tissue of the animals. There's very little left over, and both of these systems are extremely conservative. They trap and retain nutrients. And this is the key to why forests in the tropics and why reefs in the tropics can be so luxuriant and successful. When a forest is clear-cut, the nutrients that are held within it bleed. The forest loses its sediments because they can no longer be held on the ground by the vegetation. And as the vegetation rots, all of those nutrients that would normally be taken back up by the vegetation bleed into the ocean. So deforestation results in tremendous nutrient loss from the land. And we can see that here where deforestation and intensive agriculture have resulted in this sediment runoff. And the sediment runoff can kill coral reefs. It falls on the delicate tissue and smothers the reef. The biodiversity of reefs is legendary. The amount of different kinds of animals and plants that inhabit reefs is far greater than the number of different kinds of animals and plants that we would find in a tropical rainforest. To be sure, rainforests have more species, but most of those species are plants and insects, whereas coral reef has many different kinds of animals, many more kinds than are seen in forests. Humans take, break, and pollute coral reefs. These are the three principal impacts from human beings. We take stuff off the reef. We take stuff to eat, and this is akin to maybe going into a small village of people and randomly kidnapping animals and humans out of that village. So we might take a few dogs and a few cats, a few children, maybe a doctor, a teacher, something like that. That's akin to what fishing does on a reef. If too many fish are taken, it will impact the ecology of the reef. We do reef gleaning. Humans will collect shells and sell them to tourists. This is a way of making a living for the human, but at the same time, it's removing animals from the reef that have a job to do. So again, much like in a village or a town or a city, if we suddenly start to take away some vital role in that city, like say the people that collect the garbage, or the people that trim the vegetation, or the people that fix the roads, that system will slowly degrade, and we'll see the result of that. Humans also break reefs by visiting them. They stand on the reefs, and you can think of a reef as being very strong with respect to withstanding wave action, but the forces of a fin kick or a person standing on a reef are no match for most corals. And the fin kicks and just even touching a coral will disturb that fragile surface layer that is the coral animal. We now have hordes of scuba divers. And scuba divers, as well-meaning as they are often not experienced enough to dive on reefs without causing certain kinds of physical damage to those reefs. There's some reefs in the world, like the reefs in the Key Largo National Marine Sanctuary, that get hundreds of thousands of divers a year, and they just get battered by divers. Much the same way, but in a larger extent, that reefs get battered by boats that crash into them. And reefs have been hazards for boats for years, since the Spanish galleons and and people started sailing on the ocean to now. And the coral reef, even though it can stand up to the strong seas of a hurricane even, the reef is no match for the lead keel of a sailboat or the hull of a ship. The other thing we do in coral reef environments is we like to live near them. We like to live by the ocean. So in places like the Florida Keys and around the world, we have gone into mangrove swamps and we have cut down the mangroves. We have dredged channels in the mangroves and used that dredge spoil to fill the land, and then we build houses on the land. And every house has a septic tank. And when we flush the toilet, the waste goes into the septic tank, leaks out through the porous rock fill, into the canal, and eventually out to the reef. When those nutrients get to the reef, the nutrients in wastewater get to the reef, we see an increase in the growth of algae. We see growth of turf algae, of green algae, and blue-green algae. And this is symptomatic worldwide. We've also seen the rise of coral disease. And coral diseases are microbial organisms that utilize the coral tissue as substrate. So they just eat it. Much like an animal eats grass, these microbes are just metabolizing the tissue of the coral. And on islands and in lands where we see humans and human habitation and land clearing and human waste entering the ocean, we see an increase in coral disease. And again, this is global. This is worldwide. Another disease we see is called black band disease. And black band disease is caused by a group of algae called cyanophytes or blue-green algae that live in a consortium with different kinds of bacteria. And again, it slowly moves across the tissue of the coral, metabolizing the coral tissue for food and leaving behind nothing but bare substrate that is colonized by different kinds of algae, turf algae and microalgae, and then later larger animals and algae will grow on it. Then we see coral bleaching, and coral bleaching is a response to many different kinds of stress that corals can experience. If it's too cold, or the water is too fresh, or it gets too salty, or there's not enough light, or it gets too warm, the algae will be expelled from the coral. In the case of warming seas, we see algae being expelled in mass bleachings. And what we believe is happening is as the temperature increases, the algae become too active and produce too much oxygen, and that becomes toxic for the animal. So the animal expels the algae. If the temperature continues to increase, it will pass the thermal tolerance of the coral, and then the corals will die as well. So the threats that I'm showing you are threats to coral reefs, and they're global, they're regional, and they're local. They're nested within each other, and they're occurring simultaneously. They're somewhat synergistic. They interact with each other with catastrophic results. Here's an example of global stress. This is temperature in Bali on the northwest corner of Manjangan Island. And here we had a temperature probe that records temperature every 30 minutes, and it's been there since 2013. And you can see very clearly the increase and decrease, the change in temperature with the seasons. And when we get to 2016, we see that there was an inordinately hot period. And that's reflected, the stress to corals is reflected in the thick line below the thermal temperature line. And what we can see are called degree heating weeks. This is the accumulation of thermal stress. And in 2016, was a very high level of degree heating weeks. And that stress is what caused the mass bleaching of the corals throughout Indonesia and parts of the northern Indonesia and Bali, and on the Great Barrier Reef and other parts of the global ocean. In Bali, off the northwest corner of Manjangan, where The thermal probe was actually under this large coral. This is the normal coral in its normal condition, and all the other corals around it, they're yellow-brown in color. They have a lot of zooxanthellae in their tissues. And in 2016, after the bleaching, this is what we see. That coral turns bright white because the algae are gone, and what we're seeing is the sunlight reflected off the bare skeleton of the coral that still has living tissue over it, but that tissue is now clear. Notice that the corals all around the large coral are also bleached, and many of them have begun to die. As a matter of fact, on this particular reef, we measured a 40% loss of live coral cover during that period. Symphony Reef, which is around the corner on Magellan on the north side, was this beautiful reef in 2011. It was bleached in 2016, and some of it recovered, but much of it didn't. Soft corals do not feed the way corals do. They don't have polyps that feed on plankton. They rely on their algae to produce food for them. And when they lose their algae through bleaching, they slowly starve to death. And here we can see a very large colony of Sinularia slowly metabolizing itself and getting smaller. As a matter of fact, they get so small they disappear. This is a very simplistic model that we've generated to try to understand and explain the impacts of humans on reefs. Humans are really good predators. We go out and catch fish, both carnivores and herbivores on the reef. And when we do that, when we remove those fish, the algae grow. It's much like removing the lawnmowers in a community, and the grass grows. Pretty soon, the weeds begin to overgrow the trees and maybe not the trees, but the bushes. And at the same time, the same way, the benthic algae, the macroalgae, will overgrow reef corals. Humans also produce inorganic nutrients that wash into the ocean through human waste, through land clearing, through a variety of ways. And that can foster the growth of phytoplankton, which will attenuate light for corals because they'll absorb the light first, and also foster the growth of diseases. Through the process of urbanization, humans produce large amounts of sediment, and those can attenuate and smother the coral as well. So you can see in a very sort of simplistic way, what we're doing is generating stressors to the corals that attack the very advantages that corals have, or the very adaptations that corals have for living in this clear, pristine tropical ocean. We believe in this idea of conservation through participation. We believe that local communities, the true stakeholders of coral reefs in their areas, are the ones that have to invest and the ones that have the greatest to lose if that reef disappears. So guided by science, we can work with locals to reduce losses from local threats, and that will improve the resilience of those reefs to the larger scale global threats. Here you see us removing a very large conglomeration of fishing nets that had drifted onto the reef and entangled a number of large corals. Now I get to some observations about Raja Ampat. Hands down, this is the most beautiful reef system I've ever seen in my life. I have seen beautiful corals that are massive in size and just like the most beautiful, exquisite flowers you'd ever see in a tropical rainforest or in your grandmother's garden or anywhere else on Earth. These are truly magnificent coral reefs. And they're situated in a very special place. The Bird's Head Seascape, which is the western side of Papua, is situated in an area that's very far from humans and very much centered in a sweet spot for the growth of corals. These two diagrams show that, one, the reefs of Raja Ampat are situated within the global ocean conveyor belt. They receive warm, clear water from the Pacific Ocean, and it comes through the Indonesian flow-through that moves into the Indian Ocean. The second is that the reefs of Raja Ampat exist on the equator. There are no cyclones that occur in that area. So they live in an equatorial refugia from large storms that could cause catastrophic damage. So for these two reasons, these reefs are in a real sweet spot with respect to how they've developed, where they are, and potentially their conservation. This area has developed into what's been called the Coral Triangle by Charlie Vernon. It's the heart of the biosphere. And Raja Ampat is the most diverse place we've found within the Coral Triangle. So it has the highest global biodiversity of coral reefs. There are over 600 species of stony corals. Over 1,600 species of fish have been identified. Almost 700 species of mollusks, different kinds of shelled animals. This is truly the atom heart mother of Earth and the living Earth, if you will, the biosphere. And the valuation of Raja Ampat's reefs and ecological goods and services in general, as determined by Conservation International and the University of Papua in a study produced in 2007, showed that the artisanal fisheries and the commercial fisheries and reef cleaning and tourism and agriculture, mining, logging, total up to about 170 billion rupiah per year. It's about 19 million US dollars per year. And the sectors that are in green are what we would think of as goods and services that are sustainable. These can be produced over and over and over with proper care. Whereas mining and logging are extractive activities. So they're thought of as sort of hard goods and services. Once we remove them, they're gone. The value of tourism, again in a study from 2006, suggested that tourism alone was 126 billion rupiah per year. And it was growing fast, so in about 20 years it would be 1.2 trillion rupiah per year. Now, tourism is based on ecological goods and services that are renewable. They're sustainable if they're well managed. And they're worth more than 5 times the direct, hard goods and services that are extractable. So it makes sense that the cash cow of Raja Ampat will be tourism. One of the central places for tourism right now are the Dampier Straits in the Bird's Head Seascape off the island of Waigo. In this area, this evaluation by Spalding et al. From 2017 shows that the value of reefs, in other words, the on-reef value of dive sites, is critically important and very high in the area of the Dampier Straits. Within the Dampier Straits, there are many well-known reef sites, and I've had the opportunity of visiting these reef sites. And the ones that I visited are marked with the small blue-green stars. So you can get a sense of where I've been and where I'm basing my observations on diving on these various reefs. On some of them once, on some of them many times. First of all, I'd like to say there are some spectacular corals. Just blow your mind, beautiful, amazing coral reefs with beautiful, beautiful, very large, very old and venerable corals. They are more beautiful than some of the most beautiful flowers you'll ever see on Earth, and much larger. This particular world foliose coral is over 1 meter across. And then we find Acanthaster planki, the crown of thorns, eating the coral flesh and leaving behind white coral skeleton. And their tracks are easily visible on many of these reefs. And in some places, they've actually become infestations. And we have taken over 500 crown of thorns off a single reef in an afternoon. People have figured out that we can inject crown of thorns with vinegar that's basically harmless to anything else on the reef. And 2 injections of 10 milliliters will kill an adult crown of thorns in about 30 minutes. So when we heard this and we tried it out, I started a program where I got a benefactor to donate, a nonprofit donated the money to build these vinegar injection kits. And we made 100 of them and shipped them to Raja Ampat. And through the work of Wick Alliston and Conservation International and the Raja Ampat Homestay Association, we are distributing these kits to liveaboard vessels, to resorts, and to homestays, with the hopes that everybody will take part in trying to control the infestations of crown of thorns. Now you might ask, why have there been infestations of crown of thorns? Why are they suddenly becoming a problem? And the answer seems to lie in the fact that increased nutrients will increase the population of phytoplankton, which are the food for the larvae of crown of thorns. So more people, more nutrients in the water, more successful larvae, more crown of thorns starfish. The other thing I've seen on the reefs is diver damage, physical damage from careless diving. It could be a fin click that breaks a fragile branching coral, or it could be a scuba diver's tank that bangs into a slightly more robust coral. And again, scuba divers can be trained to dive more carefully. They don't have to do this kind of damage. And much of this damage could be repaired after the fact by people that have been trained to do it. We also have come across coral diseases. The black band disease, which I talked about earlier, which swept through the Florida Keys in the 1980s. We found places where this band is moving across live coral tissue and leaving behind white bare skeleton that is then colonized by a variety of algae that form an algal turf. If we zoom out on this coral, you'll see that that infection is not just in one place. And in fact, there are many colonies in this cluster that are infected with black band disease. And these diseases, these bands will expand until there's nothing else on that coral. It's just dead. I've also come across what we call white plague. And the white plague got its name because when the coral dies, it leaves behind a white coral tissue. So swimming over a reef where there's quite a bit of this disease, it looks like a white plague. In fact, it's caused by microorganisms that, again, metabolize the coral tissue as though it were food, but there's not a black band. There's just an edge where that disease is creeping over the corals. In the Florida Keys, this disease, a variant of this disease, has been traced to being caused by a prokaryotic cell, a bacterium, that lives in the human gut, Serratia marcescens. So in a way, it's a direct link between human sewage and coral disease. And again, you can see that this disease can sweep over corals and actually jump from one colony to another and infect different species on the reef. Here it is white plague sweeping across a large table coral, the table Acropora, and you can witness this on most of the reefs in the Dampier Straits now. Here's another undescribed coral disease that we found in an area where there is low light and quite a bit of fine sedimentation. That particular disease, the coral seems to bleach and then it dies. So we really don't know much about the progression of this disease or the cause of this disease, but again, it's in these areas. And here's another unknown disease to me, where we see a part of the dead coral and then an expanding ring of purple into the live coral. The other thing we find are sponges overgrowing corals. And it's well known that sponges will get a competitive edge on corals if there's an increase in particulate matter and bacteria in the water that sponges feed on. This is well known from studies in the area of Jakarta in the 1970s and 1980s. There's another example of sponges overgrowing very vibrant looking living corals, but they cannot compete with the sponges as they're overgrown. Another thing we see are macroalgae. And the algae, this particular one called Padina, will again grab the nutrients before the corals can, and they will overgrow the corals. Cyanophytes or blue-green algae, many of the same kinds of organisms that we see causing coral diseases will also grow on substrate and just overwhelm the substrate and overgrow the corals. One member of this particular group called Lingbia is well known as a symbol of nutrients or a signal of nutrients in the Florida Keys and along the coast of Florida. And then we see turf algae that grow at the edge of corals and trap fine sediment. And the fine sediment smothers the delicate tissue of the coral. It's only 3 cell layers thick, remember. And when that coral tissue dies, the algal turf will slowly grow into that area. And thus this interaction between sediment and algae slowly grows over the coral as the coral dies. In this summary slide, you can see a living coral in the center of the slide, and it's being overwhelmed by a disease to its left. At 12 o'clock above, there's a sponge that's overgrowing the coral. There are macroalgae, Padina, overgrowing the coral and other corals. And that sort of purplish shape that we see at 6 o'clock is probably either a sponge. It's probably a sponge that's overgrown the corals that were alive. So this is a reef that's under assault from all of the aspects of things that I've talked about. So the symptoms of reef degradation that we've seen worldwide, we see diseases such as white plague, black band, unknown diseases. New ones are being discovered every day. We see excess amounts of algae, both macroalgae and microalgae. We see sediments and this algal sediment tissue mortality. We see crown of thorns infestations in the Indo-Pacific, and we see physical damages caused by people. We go back to this simplistic model that I put up. We can see how deforestation will cause sediments and inorganic nutrients to wash into the land. Sewage will cause inorganic nutrients and diseases to move over the coral reef. And overfishing will remove fish and allow the algae to grow. Coral reefs need a healthy habitat to be healthy. They need high sunlight, low nutrients, low sediments, high rates of herbivory. They're a very fragile living surface, and they need excellent water quality all around. The drivers of coral reef degradation are overfishing and gleaning, essentially random kidnapping from the reef, physical damage, boats, anchors, divers, bomb fishing, deforestation and land clearing generates runoff, excessive nutrients and carbon, sewage from humans and their animals that generates excessive nutrients and bacteria, and plastics and other chemical pollutants that are toxic to the organisms that live in the sea. We do have some cures though. We have marine protected areas to manage fisheries. We can install moorings to reduce anchor damage. We can control diver damage with more careful supervision. We can provide effective treatment for sewage. We can reduce land disturbance and runoff. We can compost organic materials instead of throwing the garbage into the sea or burning it. And we can remove the use of plastics and toxic chemicals. This is not rocket science. These are all things that can easily be done if we just have the political will. So the priority needs that I see for Raja Ampat is one, to address the nutrients that are drivers of coral disease. We need to install wastewater gardens to treat human sewage and control pollution. There are about 50 villages in the area, over 100 homestays, 15 resorts, about 60 liveaboards. The villages, homestays, and resorts are on land, so wastewater gardens would be appropriate. The liveaboards are at sea. Those ships should require sewage holding tanks with a pump-out facility someplace. We need moorings to control anchor damage. We need moorings at major dive sites for the larger liveaboard boats, and we need moorings for the anchorages as well. We need to remove toxic pollutants and plastic that will help improve water quality. We need to reduce land disturbance and runoff. Homestays and resorts and villages can have vegetation buffers, pathways, boardwalks, instead of just empty sand. We can compost organic waste and generate soil to have food gardens. And we really need to educate all the stakeholders about the urgency and the need for individual as well as collective action. And these educational programs, some of them are underway. The Calabia, for example, is underway right now, visiting all the various villages in the Raja Ampat area. So as one example of one of these cures are wastewater gardens. These were designed first by Mark Nelson in the Biosphere 2 project. And they're very simple. They're gravity fed. They don't require electricity. They just require a small amount of space. First, there's a septic tank that is a watertight sealed tank in which anaerobic digestion begins to occur in the septic system. The overflow from that septic tank, gravity flows into a subsurface gravel bed that has plants growing in it. And those plants are very specific plants that live in this control box. They are chosen for their abilities to live in various kinds of water and to utilize various kinds of nutrients and to live in certain kinds of climates. And some of them can produce food or other useful edible items, as well as wood and other things that we can use in our day-to-day lives. The overflow from the first control box goes into an area of subsurface irrigation that again is planted. And the plants absorb the water and any excess nutrients that might be coming out of the control box. So in this way, both the water runoff and the nutrients from human sewage are absorbed and used to grow things that are useful to humans. So you can think of human sewage as a resource rather than something to just get out of sight, out of mind, and flush into the ocean and contribute to the death of coral reefs. Here's an example. We have a bathroom on an island that has a traditional septic system that can lead to a dying reef with the nutrients that leach out of the soil. Or we could plant a wastewater garden in which we could see the growth of beautiful plants that are both useful and beautiful, and we can have healthy reefs. We just have to make the choice of which one we want. Do we want destruction or sustainability? Captain Cousteau, who invented the aqualung and later showed us that the oceans are alive, wrote an essay in 1994, The Long Term Has No Price, in which he argued that the biological treasures of the earth are priceless. They must be conserved for future generations. And even though the value of the goods and services of the world can be valued at $33 trillion at the time, that was more than all the world's economies put together, if we had that much money, we could not use it to reconstruct a biosphere. So when somebody comes to you and says, hey, we need to remove that mangrove reef for a shrimp farm because the growing shrimp is more important than the mangrove, what we have to say is, you know, the mangroves protect us and provide goods and services that are really worth much more than the shrimp we could grow in a couple of years. So we really need to keep the mangroves, thank you very much, and grow the shrimp in another way that is less harmful to the environment. So I hope this little talk has given you some insight as to my feelings about Raja Ampat and my 2 cents and my knowledge that I have seen about coral reefs around the rest of the world is being applied to what I've seen in Raja Ampat. And I'd like to close it by saying the ocean begins at your front door. Everything that is dropped on a land surface will eventually find its way into the ocean. It's the path of water. And so the ocean begins at your front door. Every little scrap, every piece of paper, every little drop of waste that we put on the land will eventually find its way into the ocean, especially in areas as sensitive and as special as Raja Ampat. So I hope this will help you all realize and help you sort of coalesce and get to action, because we all have to begin to work at this and do the best we can to make sure that the very best reefs in the world are here for future generations and here to provide a sustainable economy for the people of Raja Ampat and Indonesia. Thanks for listening.